Welcome to Somnotales History. Tonight, we won't take you to a battlefield or a king's throne. We're going somewhere quieter, somewhere forgotten. What if you woke up in a medieval village? No war, no noise, just the slow rhythm of life, a place where time moves with the seasons, and the past feels peaceful enough to fall asleep in. Close your eyes. History is waiting. The first thing you noticed was the air. It wasn't thick with car exhaust or the hum of air conditioners or the synthetic smell of plastic packaging. It was clean, earthy, sweet, and faintly smoky, like wood still warm from last night's fire. Somewhere not far off, birds chirped, with no sense of urgency, and a soft breeze rustled through the trees. The ground beneath you wasn't a mattress or carpet, but something firmer, packed dirt with patches of soft grass and scattered straw. Your eyes opened slowly, greeted not by familiar walls, but by a sloping wooden ceiling supported by thick, rough-hewn beams. The room was dim, lit only by a shaft of golden morning light slipping through a gap in wooden shutters. Dust danced in the beam like lazy fireflies. You sat up slowly, every creak of the straw mattress beneath you echoing in the stillness. The bed frame was crude but solid, and a scratchy wool blanket lay twisted at your feet. You rubbed your eyes, trying to shake off the confusion, the eerie silence, the sense that the world had tilted on its axis. This wasn't your bedroom. It wasn't any room you'd ever known. A faint clatter came from below, metal on metal, or maybe wooden bowls, followed by the low murmur of voices. You stumbled to your feet, finding your balance as your bare soles met cold stone floor. The clothes on your body weren't your own. A coarse linen tunic hung from your shoulders, belted clumsily at the waist with a leather cord. No phone in your pocket, no watch on your wrist, only the muted sounds of morning life beyond the room. You crossed to the window and unlatched the shutter. It groaned open, revealing a scene that was not just unfamiliar, but impossible. The village lay before you in the soft, misty light of dawn. Narrow dirt paths wound between clusters of timber-framed cottages, their thatched roofs gently sloping, like golden moss-covered hills. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, rising into a sky painted with the pastel blush of early sun. A few villagers moved about, already bustling with buckets, tugging on cloaks, leading sleepy-eyed livestock out from wooden pens. Everything looked worn, lived in, but not dirty, just old. You didn't hear any cars, no planes overhead, no distant hum of electricity. There were no power lines, no paved roads, no signs. Only the rhythmic clop of hooves, the creak of wagon wheels, the call of birdsong, and the muffled chatter of people who looked like they belonged here. A man with a long beard and tunic led a cart loaded with hay. A group of children ran barefoot down the path, laughing, their cheeks flushed pink from the cool morning air. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. You turned away from the window, your breath catching slightly. Either you were dreaming or you had just woken up in a world centuries older than your own. A knock sounded at the door, a soft, hesitant tap, and it creaked open before you could respond. A woman stood, middle-aged, her dark hair tucked beneath a white linen coif. She wore a simple dress and apron, her hands dusted with flour. "Ah, you're awake," she said with a warm smile, her accent soft but unmistakably from a time long past. "You slept soundly then? The fever's gone from your cheeks." "Praise be." You opened your mouth, but words tangled somewhere in your throat. "Fever?" You blinked. I think I hit my head," you murmured. She nodded knowingly. "Yes. You were in a sorry state when Thomas brought you in." "Fell from a cart," he said. "Or maybe from the woods. Memory'll come back, I imagine. Or not. We've had worse ailments than that." She stepped aside, gesturing for you to follow. "Come, there's porridge on the fire. You need strength." And just like that, you were ushered into a new life, Downstairs, the home revealed itself to be a modest timber-framed cottage, with walls of wattle and daub, and a central hearth that still smoldered with orange coals. A pot hung over the fire, bubbling gently. The scent of oats and herbs filled the air. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding clay jugs, bunches of dried herbs, and bundles of cloth. A simple table sat in the center, with 3 wooden stools beside it. Everything felt real, solid, handmade. The woman served you a bowl of steaming porridge and watched as you ate. It was thick, earthy, and surprisingly comforting. Warmth spread through your limbs. Still, your mind reeled. How had you ended up here? Was this some elaborate reenactment? A hallucination? She introduced herself as Maud, and her husband, who entered soon after, covered in mud from the fields, was Thomas. He was built like a tree trunk, with dirt-caked hands and eyes that squinted kindly despite their weathered edges. "You'll want work," he said matter-of-factly. "Not good to idle. You've strength in your arms, I wager." You nodded slowly. "I think so." He grunted in approval. "Then come with me. The fields are always hungry." And so began your days in the village. It became clear quickly that time moved differently here. There were no clocks ticking minutes away, no alerts, no schedules dictated by screens. The village rose with the sun and slept when it disappeared behind the hills. Work was hard but honest. You learned to dig with a spade that had seen more winters than you, to haul bundles of thatch for roofing, to gather kindling and shape firewood with the dull iron blade. Your muscles ached at first, but the pain softened into rhythm, the rhythm into routine. The village itself was small but self-sufficient, surrounded by dense forest and fertile fields. There was a blacksmith named Osric, a quiet man whose forge pulsed with red fire like a beating heart. He rarely spoke, but once handed you a repaired blade without being asked. There was Edith, the baker, who rose long before dawn to knead dough. By the fire, her apron forever dusted with flour. And Brother Elred, the monk who came once a week from the nearby priory to bless the sick and share news from the world beyond the trees. Children ran barefoot through the lanes, chasing chickens, and laughter in equal measure. Old women spun wool by candlelight, humming songs older than memory. Men gathered around the alehouse fire at night, speaking in low voices about the weather, the harvest, and stories they already told a dozen times. Life was quiet, repetitive, and strangely peaceful. No one questioned where you had come from. They accepted you, as if you had always belonged. Days turned into weeks. You lost count. The modern world faded like a half-remembered dream. No one here knew what a phone was, or a microwave, or a car, and yet no one seemed to miss them. You didn't either. Not after a while. Your hands grew calloused. Your sleep became deeper. You laughed more. You spoke less. You felt lighter. And then, as the harvest moon rose high and golden in the night sky, something shifted. A storm blew through the village one night, tearing at the thatch, shaking the shutters, howling like wolves through the trees. You lay awake, the wind cold against your cheek where the blanket slipped. When you stepped outside the next morning, something felt different in the air. It wasn't just the broken branches or puddles in the dirt paths. It was something quieter, a hush beneath the normal sounds, a waiting. Brother Elred arrived that afternoon, his robe soaked from the rain, his eyes dark with worry. He spoke to Thomas in hushed tones, then to Maud, and finally to the gathered villagers by the hearth of the alehouse. "A fever," he said gravely, "has taken root in the next village." Heads bowed, eyes narrowed. You could feel the fear ripple through the room like the crackling of dry wood in fire. "We must take care," the monk continued. "Avoid travel, boil water, burn old straw, pray." That night, the village was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time since you arrived, you felt that same strange edge of the unknown when you first woke up in a place that shouldn't exist. But there was no going back now. This was your life. And the past, it seemed, was not as safe as it looked. You found yourself standing beside Thomas at dawn, the smell of damp earth rising from the fields as mist clung low to the ground. He handed you a rake and said nothing at first. His silence wasn't cold, it was simply the kind that came from years of letting the land do the talking. The fields had not changed, but there was something more solemn in the rhythm of work now. Each stroke of the rake, each turn of the soil felt heavier, like the air itself had thickened in worry. That morning, no one sang. No idle stories were exchanged between rows of cabbages and rows of barley. Even the birds seemed to keep their music muted. The news of the fever had reached everyone, and though there were no bells tolling, no proclamations from atop horses, the dread was thick in every glance and every tightened grip on a spade. Maud had begun boiling every drop of water she used, even for scrubbing the wooden table. The children were told to stay inside, and the communal well, once the heart of laughter and gossip, now stood eerily quiet, with a bucket tied tightly to its frame and a cloth wrapped over the handle. You didn't ask where the fever had come from. No one did. Asking wouldn't change what was coming. That night, you stayed indoors as the wind rose again. You sat by the fire, staring at the way the flames flickered against the walls, throwing crooked shadows that danced like spirits. Maud passed you a cup of warm broth, and for the first time, you noticed the way her hands trembled slightly. She smiled through it. Of course, she always smiled, but her eyes gave away what her lips would not. The fever arrived silently. First, it was old Goodman Ewan, who hadn't risen from his bed one morning. He'd been coughing for days, but no one thought much of it. He was old, and he coughed every winter. By the next afternoon, he was gone. His daughter, red-eyed and trembling, said she had only stepped away for a moment, and when she returned, he was no longer breathing. They buried him at dawn, without ceremony, and the villagers began sleeping farther apart. The alehouse grew quieter, the church fuller. Next was Milla, the baker's young apprentice. One day she was kneading dough, singing to herself, and the next, she was lying on the cot in Edith's back room, her skin pale, her breath shallow. She didn't speak, didn't wake, and didn't survive the week. Her parents wrapped her in linen, weeping silently, and laid her beneath the oak tree near the village edge. You helped dig the grave. The earth was cold and stiff that morning, and every strike of the shovel echoed like a drumbeat of something ancient and inevitable. But in the midst of the worry and mourning, life refused to stop. There were still goats to feed, firewood to gather, meals to cook. Thomas would rise every morning before the sun and move through his routines with the same deliberate calm as always. You followed his lead. It helped to have something to do with your hands, to carry the weight of grief, in the form of logs, or buckets, or thatched bundles. Some days, the sun would break through the clouds and cast warm light across the village square, and you would hear children's laughter again, brief but bright, a glimmer of normalcy, of hope. Brother Elred continued to visit, though less often now. His face was thinner, his eyes sunken. He carried a small leather pouch of herbs and left bundles of yarrow and feverfew with Maud each time. He told stories of how other villages were faring, of them worse off than yours. He reminded everyone to keep their faith, to keep their hands clean, and to watch for signs of the sickness. You had no idea how much time had passed. It was strange to think of days without numbers, without calendars or dates. Only the passing of seasons told the tale. Leaves yellowed and fell from the trees. The wind grew sharper. Fires were lit earlier in the day, and cloaks became constant companions. Winter was coming, and with it, the cold that slowed everything except the fever. You caught it one night. You were sure of it. It started with the chill that sank into your bones, no matter how close you sat to the fire. Then came the aching, the fever, the sense of spinning even while lying still. You heard voices in your sleep, some familiar, some not. You dreamed of metal birds in the sky and glowing screens in traffic and sirens, things you had not seen or heard since that first morning. When you woke, Maud was sitting beside you, a cool cloth pressed to your forehead, her eyes red but determined. "You'll pull through," she whispered. "You're strong." And you did. 3 days passed in a haze, and then you opened your eyes to a ceiling you'd come to recognize as home. The fever had passed. Not everyone was so lucky. Edith the baker fell next, then young Peter, then two of the men who worked beside you in the field. Their absence left hollows in the rhythm of daily life, holes that no one could patch over. Spring took its time arriving, but when it did, it brought more than just blossoms and birdsong. It brought change. With the fever finally slowing, the village breathed again. Doors that had remained shut began to open. Voices grew louder. Faces looked toward the sky instead of down at the ground. And you, strange visitor though you were, had become part of this place. They trusted you to lead the ox when Thomas's back began to ache too much to walk the fields all day. They asked your help in rebuilding a roof torn by winter winds. They sought your opinion on tools, on firewood, on when to plant. You didn't have the answers, but you gave your best, and they thanked you all the same. One night, sitting outside as the stars scattered across the dark velvet sky, Maud leaned beside you and said softly, "I wonder what your life was before you came here, what world you came from." You stayed quiet for a while before answering. "So do I," she smiled. "Perhaps it doesn't matter anymore." You weren't sure if she meant it kindly or sadly. Maybe both. The seasons passed. You watched the village breathe in the rhythm of the year, planting, growing, harvesting, resting. You learned to read the signs of the land, the moods of the sky, the needs of the livestock. Your hands, once clumsy with wooden tools, moved with quiet confidence. You didn't miss your old world as much anymore. Sometimes, late at night, you'd recall fragments in advertisement, the buzz of a fluorescent light, the soft blue glow of a screen, but they felt like dreams now, thin and weightless. There were other dangers, of course. A dry summer led to worries about the crops. A passing band of soldiers demanded shelter and food, their polished armor and curt voices unsettling the quiet rhythm of the village. But the people endured. They always did. You heard stories from travelers on the road of kings and wars, of towns that burned, of bridges built and forests felled. But those were distant worlds. Here, life was close, slow and real. And then one autumn morning, as you walked the path toward the woods with an axe slung over your shoulder, something odd caught your eye, a shimmer in the air, just a flicker like heat rising from stone. But it was cold, and there was no fire. You stepped closer. The shimmer vanished. You shook your head, rubbed your eyes, kept walking. But the next day, it returned. This time, brighter, more defined. A shape, a doorway maybe, made of light and air, and something that didn't belong. You reached out to touch it. Your fingers passed through. Behind you, the forest was silent. Before you, a breeze hummed from nowhere, carrying the faintest trace of something that made your heart stutter. A memory. You stepped back. The shimmer disappeared. That night, you couldn't sleep. You lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering a different ceiling, remembering light bulbs, refrigerators, music, asphalt, noise. You had forgotten how noisy your world was. The next morning, you didn't mention the shimmer. You worked in the fields. You fetched water. You sat by the fire, but the image burned. Behind your eyes, a choice had emerged. Or was it always there? Days passed, then weeks. The shimmer came and went, never in the same place twice. Sometimes it flickered behind the well, sometimes beneath the old oak tree, once beside the barn. Always faint, always fleeting, and always calling. But each time, you turned away. This was your world now, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper: attachment. Love, perhaps. You cared about Maud and Thomas, about the village, about the way the wind shifted before rain, about the scent of the herbs hung in the rafters. You didn't belong here, but you were needed here. That mattered, and so you stayed. Even when the shimmer came bright and clear one summer night, glowing softly at the edge of the forest, like a forgotten star fallen to earth, you stayed. You walked past it, not through it. You sat by the fire that evening, watching sparks rise into the night, and felt no fear, only peace. And though you could never explain how you had arrived in this medieval village, or why, it no longer mattered. You had not found your way back, but you had found your place. Summer settled over the village like a long, golden sigh. The sun lingered later each day, casting its warm fingers over the thatched roofs, and making the stone walls glow in the evenings. Children's laughter returned in full force, echoing down the narrow paths between homes, their games full of sticks and chasing and shrieks of innocent chaos. Life had resumed its rhythm, familiar and grounding, though something in you had subtly shifted. The shimmer was still out there. You knew it, but you no longer looked for it. Your hands had learned the language of the soil. You could walk barefoot and feel, without thought, whether the rain would come the next morning. Your ears could hear a sick sheep's cough from 50 paces. You found comfort in things that once would have seemed too quiet to matter. The smell of firewood stacked, just so. The soft creak of the mill's wheel turning in the brook. The sight of a candle flickering in the darkness, offering just enough light to feel safe, but not so much as to disturb the stillness of night. You helped Maud plant her herbs in neat rows behind the cottage. Chamomile, sage, marjoram, and the bitter-tongued yarrow. She taught you to grind them, to bind them in cloth, to hang them where the air was dry. She spoke of how each plant had its mood, some softened pain, others stirred courage, a few whispered dreams into the minds of the sick. She spoke to them as she worked, and you began to as well, without thinking. When the harvest came, the entire village moved as one. The fields filled with the rustle of wheat and barley, the laughter of shared labor, the rhythmic swish of scythes sweeping in wide arcs. You rose before the sun and returned to bed long after its orange glow had faded behind the hills. Your back ached, your arms throbbed, but your heart beat quietly in time with everything around you. One evening, as the harvest wound down, you sat outside the alehouse with Thomas and 2 of the older men. They passed around a jug of dark mead and spoke in low voices, not of the world beyond, but of the earth beneath. Weather patterns, root rot, the behavior of crows. You listened. You offered a comment. They nodded in approval. It was only later that you realized something had changed again. They no longer saw you as the outsider. You had become part of the fabric, a thread woven in. When winter returned, it did so without the fear of the last. There was no fever this time, only the quiet work of survival. Smoke rose from every chimney. Salted meat hung in sheds. Firewood was stacked high beneath the eaves. The village huddled close, sharing warmth, stories, and food. You had carved a small whistle for one of the children and found it resting on your windowsill the next morning with a piece of bread wrapped in cloth beside it. A thank you, unspoken but clear. That was how the village thanked, through gesture, not grand words. Maud grew slower that year. Her joints stiffened. She walked with a slight limp. You took on more of the housework without being asked. She noticed. One morning, as you swept ash from the hearth, she patted your shoulder gently and said, "You remind me of my brother. Steady, always watching, You never met her brother. You weren't sure if he was dead or simply gone. People here didn't always say the full truth, but they said enough to matter. And then, one morning in the quiet of late frost, a message came. A rider, cloaked in blue, arrived with a scroll marked in wax. The village gathered in the square as the monk read the contents aloud. Taxes would increase. Grain would be taken. The new Lord's son required a levy. The villagers listened, eyes low. There was no protest, only acceptance. That night, the talk around the fire was heavier. People spoke of lean years, of tightening belts, of old seasons when they had eaten roots and nothing more. You offered your share from the stores, and others did the same. No one was left hungry, not that year, but it left a scar. Small, quiet. But there, you began to notice other things. Cracks in the timber of the chapel, rot in the thatch of Osric's forge, splinters in the handles of tools worn too thin. The village was surviving, but not thriving. And it struck you one day, as you watched a child chase a chicken through the mud, that this world, though beautiful, was never safe. Not really. It had its own cruel rhythms. Sickness, drought, war, hunger. There were no hospitals, no safety nets, no mercy from the elements, and yet no one complained. Because there was dignity in the struggle, the dignity of getting up every day and doing what needed to be done, the dignity of knowing that your hands mattered, that your work was seen. You found yourself carving more things now. Spoons, whistles, handles. You worked by firelight, the grain of the wood telling you what it wanted to be. You gave these gifts away quietly, left on doorsteps, tucked beside windows, slipped into satchels. One of the children gave you a necklace made of string and berry seeds in return. You wore it every day after. That spring, Maud fell ill. Not the fever, just age. The slow unwinding of the body. You sat by her bedside, watching the light shift across the wooden beams. She told you stories of her childhood, of winters when the snow buried the fence posts, of a cat that lived 20 years, of the first time she saw the sea. You didn't speak much. You didn't need to. When she passed, the entire village gathered beneath the oak tree. Thomas stood with his hands folded and his head bowed. You said a few words. They were simple, honest. She would have liked that. You helped dig the grave. The earth was soft from rain. You placed a small wooden carving of a sprig of sage in her hand before they lowered her down. That night, Thomas didn't come home. He stayed in the alehouse, drinking alone. You lit the fire, tidied the house, and placed his supper on the table. He didn't eat it, but the next morning, he patted your shoulder once, in silence, before heading back to the fields. Time passed. You thought often of the shimmer. It hadn't appeared in months. Maybe it never would again. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it had been a doorway. Or maybe just your mind playing tricks. But the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. This was your world, and you had chosen it. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the trees and the air turned golden and soft, you saw something on the edge of the village, a figure, tall and thin, wrapped in a cloak, unlike any you'd seen before. They stood quietly, watching. You walked toward them. The figure turned, slowly, and pulled back their hood. It was your face. Not entirely, but close. Enough to unsettle, enough to recognize. Their eyes were your eyes. Older, perhaps. Sharper. Tired. They said nothing, just held out their hand. You didn't take it. Instead, you asked softly, "Why are you here?" The figure tilted their head. To remind you of what? That you do not belong. You looked around, at the trees, at the fields, at the soft smoke curling from chimneys. "Maybe," you said, "but I'm needed." The figure lowered their hand. For a moment, you thought they might smile, but instead, they turned and walked away, fading into the shadows at the edge of the woods. You never saw them again. And yet, the encounter left something behind, a certainty. You had not imagined your old life. It had been real. It still was. But it wasn't here. You had chosen this world. And that choice gave it weight. Years passed. Your hair grayed. Your steps slowed. New children were born. Old friends passed. The village changed, but slowly. Like a river carving stone, the shifts were subtle and patient. You taught what you knew to others. How to sharpen a blade without splitting the grain. How to coax fire from damp wood. How to listen to the wind. One of the young men, quiet, clever, asked you once if you had ever lived anywhere else. You looked at him, and after a long silence, you said, "I've lived 2 lives, but only one that mattered." He didn't ask again. That winter was hard. The snow came early and stayed long. The grain stores thinned, but no one starved. You gave your share, as you always did. Your bones ached more now. You spent longer at the fire, carving slower, thinking more. And one morning, as the frost kissed every branch and the sky hung pale and silver, you felt something deep within, a stillness. Like the world had stopped moving. Just for a moment, you walked to the edge of the village, past the oak tree, past the brook, past the line of stones that marked the field's end. There, in the clearing, stood the shimmer, brighter than ever. Solid now, real. You stepped toward it, then stopped, and turned away. Spring crept in slowly that year, as if cautious not to disturb the stillness left by winter. The frost didn't lift all at once, but rather in quiet, shrinking patches. First along the south-facing walls, then on the worn paths between homes, until finally even the roots dared to stretch upward again. Snowmelt trickled into the earth, soaking the soil and feeding the dormant seeds buried below. And with it came a new breath in the village, a sense that life, though tested, would carry on. You rose earlier each day, not from obligation, but from habit, a rhythm etched deep into your bones. You no longer needed to be woken or summoned. You moved through your morning chores as naturally as wind passing through the trees, checking the firewood, feeding the hens, drawing water from the well. Your fingers had grown stiff in the cold months, but they remembered each motion. The ache was familiar now, almost welcome, proof that you still had purpose. Thomas was slower these days. The years had left their imprint on his back, which bent further than before, and his breath came shorter after long walks. But his eyes remained sharp, and he still carried a quiet strength, the kind that didn't boast or announce itself, but simply endured. He leaned on you more, though never said so directly. A longer pause before asking you to hitch the plow. A nod of thanks after you lifted the heavier sacks of grain. The way he passed you the keys to the shed without comment. The same way a torch is passed in the dark, not ceremoniously, but necessarily. New children had been born in the village since your arrival, their eyes wide and curious, their feet fast and clumsy. They knew you not as a stranger, but as someone who had always been there. They called you by name, tugged on your sleeve, asked you to carve them animals from wood. You did. You carved tiny rabbits, bears, pigs, and even a dragon. Once, though, you told no one where the idea had come from. One of the boys carried his carved ox everywhere, even while sleeping. You saw it peeking from under his blanket one night as you passed his family's cottage. The seasons moved forward with a gentle steadiness. The barley sprouted in neat rows. The sheep gave birth in the late rains. You helped Osric the blacksmith repair a wagon axle one afternoon, your hands blackened with soot and sweat, and when you were finished, he grunted and handed you a round loaf of bread. That was thanks enough. Sometimes, you thought about the world you'd come from. It wasn't gone, not really. It lived somewhere behind your eyes, in dreams and memories, and those strange moments when a turn of phrase or the shape of a shadow stirred a recognition you couldn't place. But it had grown faint, like a candle left burning too long in the daylight. There were no new machines here, no glow of technology, no buzz of progress. But there was growth, real growth. You could feel it in the dirt beneath your nails, in the way your shoulders held weight they'd once dropped, in the way people turned to you not because they had to, but because they trusted you. The shimmer didn't return, or perhaps it did, and you simply stopped noticing. One evening, the village gathered for the midsummer festival. It was a humble affair. Music played on carved flutes and fiddles, a fire in the square, simple food, and laughter. Children danced, their hair woven with wildflowers. Old men told the same stories they always told, stories everyone knew by heart, but still listened to with smiles. You sat with Thomas and the miller's wife, sipping warm cider and watching the sky grow dark. A young woman named Ellen sat beside you for a time. She had kind eyes and calloused hands, the kind that knew both labor and gentleness. She had lost her father to the fever years ago now, but had never let it harden her. She smiled when she spoke, not because she was trying to be kind, but because that was her nature. I remember when you first arrived, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. You looked like a ghost, lost. Maybe I was, you replied. She tilted her head. Not anymore. You didn't answer. You didn't need to. That night, after the fires burned low and the music faded into the crickets and wind, you walked back through the village alone. You paused near the edge of the woods, where once a shimmer had stood. The air was calm, still, just trees now, just leaves and stars above. You slept deeply that night, not because you were exhausted, but because you were at peace. In the months that followed, life remained steady, though not without challenges. A wolf took 2 sheep one night, slipping silently past the wooden fence. You joined the others in tracking it through the woods, though it was never found. The remaining flock was moved closer to the cottages, and torches burned at night to keep the predators away. A merchant caravan passed through, bringing salt and fabric and strange coins stamped with faces none of you recognized. You bartered for a spool of thread and a curved knife that fit perfectly in your palm. The merchant spoke of cities far beyond the forests, of towers of stone, and markets crowded with voices. You listened, but felt no pull. You'd seen cities before. You had lived in one, and you remembered how alone you had felt among so many people. Here, there was solitude, but not loneliness. You repaired a roof for the apothecary. You helped a boy learn to tie proper knots. You soothed a goat during a difficult birth. You carved a new handle for the village bell, which cracked that winter from the cold. With each act, you wove yourself deeper into the tapestry of the village. Then, one afternoon, as autumn leaves began to fall in soft spirals, Thomas asked you to walk with him to the chapel. He didn't speak much as you walked, just the crunch of leaves beneath your feet, the wind stirring the trees. When you arrived, he sat on the stone bench beside the door, looking out across the village. It's nearly time, he said. You didn't ask what he meant. You already knew. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, the edges worn, the ink faded. My father left this, he said, placing it in your hands, a record of our fields, the seeds, the tools. It's nothing formal, but it holds the memory of the land. You opened it slowly. Scrawled lines and notes filled the page. Measurements, planting cycles, a rough map of the farm. You traced a line with your finger. You should keep it, Thomas said. The land knows you now, and you know it. You nodded. You didn't trust your voice to speak. Thomas passed that winter quietly, in his sleep. There was no pain, no struggle. He simply didn't rise one morning. You found him, hands folded, the faintest smile still on his lips. You buried him beside Maud, beneath the oak tree, that spring. The village looked to you. They didn't name you leader. There were no titles here, but when something needed fixing, they came to your door. When a dispute rose, they sought your ear. When the children asked questions, they came to you for answers. And so you gave. You gave your time, your strength, your stories. Years passed. The faces of the children changed. The faces of the old faded. Homes were repaired, rebuilt. A new family arrived from a distant village and was welcomed with bread and cider and space by the fire. You taught the next generation how to read the weather, how to feel the earth with their hands, how to listen for sickness in the livestock, how to live not by taming the world, but by understanding it. Sometimes, at night, you'd stand beneath the stars and wonder what had brought you here. Whether it was accident or design, whether you had been chosen or simply lost. And sometimes you'd imagine that shimmer, still hidden somewhere beyond the trees, waiting quietly, but you no longer searched. Your story had become this place, and even if the door opened again, you knew now with quiet certainty you would not walk through it. The wheel of the year turned as it always did, with no need for calendars or clocks. Time in the village was marked not by numbers, but by the feel of the wind, the shift in the light, the hum of insects returning in spring, and the slow hush that settled in when the first frost dusted the roofs. You no longer thought of weeks or months. Time had become something softer here, woven into the pattern of daily life, where the same chores repeated, but never truly felt the same. You had taken over Thomas's fields in full now, though the village still helped during planting and harvest. You worked with the same tools he had once used, the ones passed down through his family. They had become part of your hands, familiar as breathing. Your palms were thick with calluses, your arms lean but strong, and your body understood the rhythm of labor as instinctively as your lungs knew how to breathe. The mornings remained your favorite time, the first light of dawn slipping over the treetops, dew dampening the grass, and the low bleat of sheep calling for attention from their pens. You would often walk the edges of the village at first light, checking fences, nodding silently to others who stirred early. There was rarely any need for conversation than just presence, quiet and mutual. Ellen had become a regular visitor. At first, it was under the guise of returning a borrowed tool, or asking your thoughts on a patch of garden soil that didn't seem to take to onions. But gradually, the visits became less about errands and more about shared moments. A cup of broth, a walk to the brook, a slow, meandering conversation about the shapes of clouds or the memory of a song her mother used to hum. She had an easy way about her, not rushed or loud, but steady and grounded, like the trees that lined the edge of the forest, deeply rooted, shaped by seasons. You found comfort in her company, not because she offered answers, but because she never seemed to expect any. With her, silence wasn't empty, it was full of understanding. One evening, as the sky deepened into dusk and the scent of wood smoke curled through the air, you stood beside her at the edge of the fields, watching the sun disappear behind the hills. She pointed toward the horizon and said, "Some say beyond those woods, there's a city where everything's made of glass, where light never fades." You looked at her, curious. "Do you believe that?" She shrugged. "I used to, when I was little. Now, I think the world is stranger than we can ever really know." You nodded. "It is." She turned to you then, her voice quieter. "I don't think you're from here." You didn't reply. "I don't mean it in a bad way," she said quickly. "You've done more for this place than anyone. It's just, sometimes I look at you, and it's like you're listening for something the rest of us can't hear." You studied her face, sincere, open. "Maybe I was," you said softly, "but not anymore." She smiled, and the silence between you settled again, comfortable as an old cloak. The next season was one of growth. The barley ripened golden and thick. The sheep bore strong lambs. The forest, once thinned by too many winters, burst with life again. Mushrooms, berries, even deer sightings returned. The village thrived. A carpenter's son built a new granary beside the mill. The blacksmith's daughter began learning her father's trade, her arms strong, her gaze fierce. A group of boys built a raft and tried to sail it down the brook, only to end up waist deep in mud and laughter. You were asked to bless the planting one spring morning. You weren't the priest, nor did you pretend to be, but they trusted you. So you stood beside the field, held a sprig of rosemary in one hand, and said the words that felt truest. Grow where you are planted, bend when the wind comes, rest when the frost settles, and rise again. That year, the harvest was more bountiful than anyone could remember, and then came the message, a letter, written in trembling hand, delivered by a traveling friar. It was addressed to no one and everyone. War was moving through the lowlands. A neighboring region had fallen. Refugees might come. Roads should be watched. Food should be stored. It wasn't the first time such news had arrived, but this one felt closer. You helped gather extra grain. You reinforced fences. You taught the younger villagers how to sharpen tools and repair breaches in the boundary walls. The shimmer, long forgotten, flickered once that night at the edge of the woods. You saw it. You acknowledged it. Then you turned away. The refugees came 2 weeks later, tired, thin, eyes hollow, a group of 20, some barely more than children. They had lost everything. Their village had been burned. You gave them shelter in the barn and food from the stores. The villagers took them in without question. That was how it was here. You listened to their stories in the quiet hours of night, of fire in the fields, of armored men shouting in a language no one recognized, of hiding beneath floorboards and fleeing through dark woods. And though your world had never held swords and torches, you understood the feeling of being lost in a place you didn't choose. One boy, no older than 12, clung to a leather pouch. Inside was a carved figure, his father's. You asked him about it one day, and he told you it was all he had left. You took a piece of oak and shaped a new one for him, a lion, crouched and ready. He didn't say thank you, but he slept with it beside him every night. The village grew quieter again, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The newcomers were folded into daily life. They helped in the fields, mended clothing, sang strange lullabies by the fire. Slowly, they began to smile again. You found yourself teaching more than ever now, passing on everything you knew, not just about crops and weather, but about kindness, about holding space for others, about how to live with the land instead of simply on it. The younger ones listened with wide eyes. The older ones nodded in understanding. One crisp morning, Ellen found you tending the garden. She knelt beside you and said, "You've changed this place. I hope you know that." You looked at the rows of herbs, neat and thriving. "I didn't do it alone, no," she said, "but it wouldn't have happened without you." The days continued, quiet and steady. You celebrated births. You helped build a new chicken coop. You sat by the fire and taught a girl how to carve her name into wood. She showed you proudly, and you smiled. You dreamed rarely now, and when you did, it wasn't of the old world, but of this one, of lambs being born, of fields rippling in wind, of laughter echoing in the village square. Sometimes you stood at the edge of the forest, hands folded, remembering the first time you'd woken in this strange and ancient place. You couldn't recall the last time you'd thought about cars or cities or wires. You had traded them for something deeper, something real. You wondered if anyone in that other life remembered you, if your name was still whispered by anyone, or if your old world had moved on, unaware that you had quietly stepped away from it. But you weren't sad. You had lived one life there, and you had lived another here. And this one, by every measure that mattered, had been the fuller. The days stretched long as summer reached its height again. The sun rose early, its light slipping through the shutters before the cockerel even stirred, and lingered until the sky turned the color of ash and then ink. Crops swelled under the warm skies. The fields rustled with promise. Bees moved lazily from flower to flower, drunk on nectar. The scent of thyme and lavender curled in through open windows and lingered in the woolen hems of sleeves and cloaks. Everything about the season hummed with life. You found yourself sitting beneath the oak tree one afternoon, watching the wind move through the barley like water. Ellen was beside you, weaving a length of dried grass into a small loop for a child's game. Neither of you spoke. There was no need. The silence between you was not empty, it was full of shared years, shared glances, shared moments of helping, listening, growing. In another world, perhaps, there would have been something more defined between you. But here, the way you lived and the way you gave and received was enough. You were hers, and she was yours, in the quietest, most rooted way possible. A little girl came running toward you across the grass, holding a sprig of mint and a folded piece of cloth. She thrust it into your hands and whispered, "Mama says this is for your knees." You smiled and thanked her, placing the mint behind your ear as she giggled and ran back the way she'd come. You turned to Ellen, who was already smiling. "She watches everything," Ellen said, brushing grass from her lap. "Sees more than most." You nodded. "She reminds me of someone I used to know." The days flowed like water. Tasks came and went. You worked the fields. You sharpened tools. You helped a woman give birth in the middle of the night, holding a lantern in one hand and her hand in the other. The child arrived just before dawn, strong and loud and pink. You helped wash the child, wrap him, and placed him gently in his mother's arms. She wept, then laughed, and named him Tom. Later, you carved a small horse for him and left it on the windowsill before sunrise. The child would grow up, never knowing you hadn't always been here. The seasons shifted again. The edge of autumn crept into the air-cool mornings, leaves losing their green, apples ripening in the trees. You gathered bundles of herbs with Ellen and hung them from the rafters. You took stock of the grain the village prepared, as it always did. Wood was chopped and stacked. Animals were moved to shelter. Windows were patched. Roofs checked. The rhythm of preparation was its own kind of music. One night, as you sat by the fire carving a small bird from oak, Ellen came in and set a bowl of soup beside you. She sat quietly for a while, watching the flames. Then she asked, "Have you ever thought of leaving?" You paused, the knife resting against the bird's wing. "Yes," you said after a long moment. "A long time ago, and now?" You met her eyes. "No." She looked down, then smiled softly. "Good." That night, you dreamed not of the past, but of the village, of the oak tree, the winding brook, the sound of the bell in the distance. You dreamed of walking through the fields with bare feet, of rain falling gently on your shoulders, of laughter carried by the wind. When you woke, it was still dark, but your heart was calm. That winter was gentle. Snow fell only twice, and the frost never bit deep. The firewood stores lasted. No one went hungry. The older villagers said it was the easiest cold season in memory. You spent many evenings teaching the children how to carve. You gave them scraps of wood and let them shape whatever they imagined. Some made boats. Others tried to make animals. One carved a circle and told you it was the moon. You kept that one for yourself. And when spring returned again, there were flowers growing where no one remembered planting them, tiny white blossoms between the stones, bright purple ones near the well. The earth had begun to answer your kindness, in its own way. One day, as you walked through the village, the wind picked up, and a swirl of petals flew through the air. A boy ran past you chasing them with a wide grin, and for a brief second, You felt the world tilt just slightly, as if something unseen had acknowledged your presence. You stood still and breathed. The shimmer had not returned, but something else had. A feeling that this life, this quiet rhythm, had become something sacred. Years passed, but slowly. Time in the village did not rush. It unfolded. You began to feel it in your joints first, a little more stiffness each morning, little more time needed to rise. You didn't complain. No one did. Aging was not an affliction here. It was simply part of the story. You sat by the fire more, though you still worked each day. Children had become adults. Faces had changed. Ellen's hair was streaked with silver now, and her steps were slower, but her eyes still carried the same light. You sometimes sat on the bench outside your cottage together, watching dusk settle like a blanket over the rooftops, neither of you saying much. One evening, the stars were especially clear, and she turned to you and said, "If you could go back, would you?" You knew what she meant. You looked at the stars and thought of lights you once knew, artificial ones, electric and harsh, streets, screens, motion, noise. "No," you said softly, "not anymore." She took your hand, warm and weathered. "Then, I'm glad you stayed. You spent more time teaching. You passed on everything. You wrote things down, not for yourself, but for the ones who would come after. You drew diagrams, mapped crop rotations, carved wooden tablets with lessons how to make a fire with wet wood, how to store seeds, how to read the clouds. You carved one final piece, a large, smooth ring, polished and simple. You didn't know why, but it felt right. You left it hanging from the beam above your hearth, and one morning, as the frost melted into the earth and the sky blushed with dawn, you felt tired, not from work, not from age, just complete. You stepped outside, listened to the birds, and walked to the oak tree. You sat beneath it, as you had many times, and closed your eyes, and the village carried on. And oh, great fanfare. No shouts or tears, just the quiet continuation of everything you had helped build. They would remember you not with statues or songs, but with the way they planted, the way they shared, the way they listened to the earth, with how they lived. The children would repeat your lessons. The carvings you made would sit on shelves and windowsills, worn smooth by time and touch. And deep in the forest, far from any path, the shimmer would flicker once more, not as a door, not as an escape, but as a memory, soft and distant, of a life once lived in another world, and of the one who had walked away from it, not to be forgotten, but to truly belong somewhere else. And so your story settled into the soil of that quiet village, not lost, but planted. Time passed without fanfare. The village did what it always had. It endured, and in doing so, it changed, but slowly, gently, in the way of rivers curving new paths over generations. New children were born, new animals raised, new fields sown, but the rhythm remained. The same bells rang out, the same wind carried across the thatched roofs, the same sunlight touched the same cobbled paths you once walked. Your cottage became a quiet part of the village now. The tools were still there, hung in their places. The hearth, still blackened by years of fire. The bench, still smooth from use. The ring you carved above the mantel still caught the morning light. No one moved anything. No one dared. It stood, as it was, as though you had only stepped out for a moment, and might return at any time. And perhaps, in some way, you had never left. Ellen tended your garden. She kept it just as you liked it, simple, functional, with herbs growing in clean rows and mint crowding the edges. Sometimes she sat on the bench and watched the gate, her fingers moving slowly as she worked a length of yarn or cleaned a bundle of carrots. She never spoke of you in the past tense, only in quiet memories shared between tasks. "He liked to plant sage there," she would say, Or, he always said marjoram grows better after frost. And the others listened, because they remembered, too. The children who had learned to carve with you began to teach others. Your tools were used respectfully, passed from one hand to the next. Your shapes were copied, then altered, then evolved. Someone began carving birds with longer wings. Another made boats that floated better than any you had carved. And yet, all of them traced their skills back to those quiet evenings by the fire, where your calm hands guided theirs. They said your name with reverence, not loud, not exaggerated, but with the same steadiness you had taught them to value. And slowly, your story became part of the village's story. People spoke of a time before you arrived, those hard years, the fever, the hunger. And then they spoke of the seasons that followed, when things began to grow again. They never used grand words. They simply said things got better. He came from somewhere else. They'd whisper to wide-eyed children. We don't know where. He didn't say, but he helped us remember who we were. And the children would ask, will he come back? And the elders would answer, he never really left. The shimmer did return once. A little girl named Wren saw it while gathering berries near the stream. She was quiet and curious, like you had been, and didn't run when it appeared. She said it looked like a curtain of wind and starlight, soft as water. She stood before it for a long time, and said she thought she heard a voice, a man, not calling to her, but remembering her. When she blinked, it was gone, she told Ellen. Ellen only smiled. He saw something once too, she said. And like you, he chose to stay. Wren grew up and became a healer. She kept dried yarrow and sweetgrass in her satchel. She told people where to plant their garlic and when to move their sheep uphill. When asked where she had learned all this, she pointed toward your cottage and said, from someone who listened more than he spoke. The village grew, not in size, but in depth, in roots. Travelers came and went, often staying only a night or two. Some brought news of distant wars, or strange beasts in the northern forests, or plagues that passed through cities, like fire. The villagers listened quietly, fed them warm broth, offered them beds of straw, and sent them on with loaves of bread. The news never stirred them. They had heard it all before. They had learned not to fear what they could not see. They had learned to trust what was around them, the soil, the sky, the hands of their neighbors. One day, many years after your passing, a group of monks visited the village. They came from the mountains, pale and sunburned, speaking of a library built in stone, and of maps that showed rivers where none flowed. They were searching, they said, for a lost path, a doorway between places. They asked if any strange things had ever happened in the village, any signs, any visitors who did not belong. The villagers looked at one another and said nothing, because you had belonged. The monks left, empty-handed, puzzled by the stillness of the place, unaware that they had walked through the very story they were chasing. But shimmer, if it ever came again, did so quietly, and always to those who no longer needed it. In time, Ellen passed too. They buried her beside the oak tree. Beside you, the village gathered as they always did. There were no grand ceremonies, no stone towers built, no songs carved into tablets, just silence, soft and whole, just hands on shoulders, just a meal shared afterward, in her honor. The garden behind your home was kept up by a young woman named Mira. She was strong, quick-witted, and had a laugh that startled the birds. She had never met you, not truly. She had been born long after your time, but she spoke of you as if you had raised her. You built this place, she told her younger brother as they turned the soil one spring. You didn't see it happen, but it's true. He taught everyone how to slow down, how to see what matters. And the boy nodded, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. Your name lived in their stories, but not as a hero, as something quieter, a part of the wood in the beams, a thread in the blanket, a grain in the bread. Sometimes, people walking through the forest would feel a stillness settle over them and pause, heart quiet, unsure why. And in those moments, some would say they saw something, a shimmer, a shape, a breath of warmth, like someone passing just out of reach, and they would whisper, "He's still here." In 100 years, the village still stood. The world beyond it had changed. Wars had risen and ended, cities built and broken, languages shifted, but the village remained steady. A small place, a quiet one, unmarked on most maps, but always known by those who needed it. People came not in crowds, but one at a time, lost, perhaps, tired, living not for gold or glory or salvation, just stillness. And they found it, because you had planted it there. And so, the life you lived quiet, unnoticed, by kings or scribes echoed on in the lives of those who tilled the same soil, drank from the same brook, and stood under the same oak tree where your story began. You had once awoken in a strange world, unrecognizable and rough, stripped of all the things you thought you needed, but in losing them, you had found something better, a place not built for speed or noise or progress, but for presence, for peace. And in the end, there was nothing more, just the wind in the leaves, the sun on the fields, and the whisper of a name, carried softly through the seasons, like a memory too warm to fade. Yours, forever, rooted, forever home. The village had known many seasons since your passing, and yet your presence lingered in the spaces between voices, between footsteps, between the rustling of leaves along the path from the brook to the square. The rhythms you helped restore had deepened over the years, growing into the bones of the village like roots into soil. It was no longer just the place where you had lived, it was the place shaped by your quiet ways, your patient hands, your listening. Mira now lived in your old cottage. She had not moved anything of yours, only added to it. The herbs still hung above the window, though she had added lemon balm and wild hyssop to your old collection. The carved ring you'd left above the hearth still caught the morning sun. She often sat at your bench in the evenings, her hands working through seeds or carving pieces of soft wood for the children who stopped by after chores. They called her the one who remembers, though she never claimed to remember much, but she did. Every lesson passed to her had taken root, and though she never said your name aloud unless asked, it echoed quietly in everything she did. She had become the one people turned to, not for answers, but for the kind of comfort that came from someone who paid attention. She didn't offer advice the way others might. She asked questions. She listened. She pointed toward the soil, or the sky, or a sprouting branch, and let people find their way from there. It was how you had taught her, though you had never called it teaching. The village had grown not in size, but in layers. Families who had once arrived as strangers had woven themselves into its fabric. The boy who once clutched a carved lion had become a father himself now, his own children racing barefoot past the brook, chasing fireflies and stories. The girl who had seen the shimmer in the wood's wren had grown tall and thoughtful, with a healer's mind and a deep respect for silence. She rarely spoke of that day by the shimmer, but those closest to her knew. She still walked that part of the forest from time to time, leaving offerings of rosemary and folded leaves where the air once glowed. On the first warm day of early spring, Wren knelt by the base of the oak tree where you and Ellen had been laid to rest. She placed a sprig of thyme and a tiny piece of carved yew wood, her own work, between the roots. It was not ritual, it was gratitude. She stayed there for some time, her palms pressed to the cool soil, her eyes closed, her breath slow. When she rose, she did not speak, but that evening she began to write. Wren had always been curious about the way time moved in circles. She had begun keeping records, not dates, not hours, but events. When the swallows first returned, when the frost came later than expected, when children began dreaming of lights in the forest. Her notebooks were thin and carefully bound, each filled with observations drawn in charcoal, leaf shapes, cloud lines, patterns of animal tracks in the snow. She had begun a new one that day, and on the first page she had written a single line. This place listens back. In the evenings, when the sun dipped below the hills and the wind moved low through the trees, the village gathered more often now than before, not out of fear or formality, but out of comfort. The square had grown into a circle, benches carved from fallen limbs, curving around a central stone fire pit that Mira and several others had built together. The stone had once been part of the ruined granary wall, salvaged and softened by time. They burned slow fires there now. No announcements, no stories rehearsed. Just warmth, tea brewed in old iron pots, the occasional hum of someone remembering a tune from childhood. That night, as Wren sat by the fire with Mira, she shared her page. Mira read it slowly, then handed it back with a small nod. "I think it does," she said, and they sat there, just listening. In the far hills beyond the forest, change stirred. Not the kind that came with fire and flags, but with quiet movement. A family of traders from a river town had been displaced. Floodwaters had swallowed their homes, and they had followed the road west in search of higher ground. They arrived in the village one dusty afternoon, with tired oxen, well-kept wagons, and cautious eyes. The villagers welcomed them without ceremony. An old barn was cleared. Blankets were shared. The children, though unsure at first, quickly began showing the newcomers how to find wild apples and where the best stones could be found for skipping across the brook. The traders spoke of strange winds in the east and of low voices in the marshlands, but the village listened and did not fear. They had known long ago what mattered most, not where someone had come from, but how they were willing to live now. One of the traders, a woman named Corla, was older and observant, with ink-stained hands and a fondness for collecting worn bits of glass. She carried with her a bundle of scrolls, maps, symbols, fragments of ideas that had passed from one port town to another. She took a quiet liking to Mira and often sat with her, the two of them exchanging knowledge like threads in a loom. "You live as if this world is enough," Corla said one evening, watching the way Mira stirred her tea. Mira glanced at her, smiling. "Isn't it?" Corla didn't answer at first. Then she unrolled one of her scrolls and pointed to a symbol, a circle with lines moving outward like sunbeams. "I've seen this drawn in 5 villages over 3 decades," she said. "Different people, same shape, always found near places where things are quiet." Mira studied it. "It's a listening place." Corla nodded. "That's what I think too." From then on, Wren, Mira, and Corla began mapping not land, but moments. Not distances, but patterns. They traced the dreams of children who spoke of echoes and trees. They noted when deer paused at the same bend in the path. They marked days when the wind carried the scent of something that couldn't be named. Not magic, not prophecy, just presence. Something noticing them, gently, from just beyond the visible. One morning, as Wren checked the herbs drying in her cottage, she noticed a slip of bark resting on her windowsill. It was smooth, with a single marking carved into its face, a spiral, open at one edge. It hadn't been there the night before. She turned it in her hands, listening not for sound, but for meaning. And when she stepped outside, she saw small impressions in the mud. Bare feet, too small for an adult, too wide for a child. She didn't follow them. She only bent, placed the bark back on the windowsill, and whispered, "I see you." No one else in the village needed to know. Some things belong to the quiet. The seasons turned again. Children grew, trees fell and were planted. The village began keeping a shared book, built from stitched parchment and wooden covers. It didn't track history as others did. It held no names of rulers or years of storms. Instead, it held recipes for soups that calmed fevers, instructions on how to repair a roof in wind, drawings of how Wren had shown children to wrap cloth for sprained wrists, reflections from those who had once lost everything and found something better. At the front of the book was carved a single line, so faint it was nearly missed. Not everything that listens needs to speak. No one remembered who had written it first, and that was part of its truth. One late autumn day, when the first frost had touched the tops of the fence posts and turned the field grass to silver, Mira walked to the oak tree alone. She sat there, as she often did, but this time she brought something with her, a small bundle wrapped in linen. She laid it on the earth between your resting place and Ellen's. Then she unfolded it slowly. Inside was a simple wooden carving unfinished. It was a figure, seated beneath a tree, one hand resting on the earth, the other open toward the sky. She had started it years ago, but never finished it. Not because she hadn't known how, but because some things should remain in the becoming. She left it there, folded the cloth back over, and stood. As she walked back to the village, the wind picked up. Leaves scattered. The air turned colder, and far in the forest, a shimmer moved between the trees, not calling, not asking, just watching. Listening. As the village always had. The frost deepened over the following weeks. The village grew quieter, not from fear or absence, but from the way winter always pulled people inward. Doors stayed shut a little longer in the morning. Fires were stoked before the sun had properly risen. Smoke curled steadily from the chimneys in thin, pale ribbons that dissolved into the white sky. Snow hadn't yet fallen, but its scent was already in the air, a clean, dry coldness that gathered around the bones and wrapped itself around rooftops like a silent visitor. In Mira's cottage, the warmth was steady. She rose each morning before the birds and moved through her tasks without speaking. The floor creaked the same way it always had. The wind rattled the shutters with its familiar tone. She touched the wooden ring above the hearth as she passed by, as she always did, more out of memory than ritual. Outside, Wren walked the edge of the woods, basket in hand, eyes on the frost-covered grass. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just watching the signs. The plants knew more than people sometimes, and in winter, they whispered only when asked kindly. She passed the spot near the brook where she'd once seen the shimmer. It wasn't there now, but the trees still bent slightly inward, as if remembering. Wren paused and knelt beside a moss-covered stone. She traced her finger across it, brushing away the frost, revealing the spiral she'd carved years ago. It hadn't faded. She smiled faintly and kept walking. Back in the village, the traders who had arrived months before had now fully settled. Their children no longer flinched at sudden noises. Their oxen had grown stronger. Corla, the mapmaker, had begun sharing parts of her scrolls during the long evenings. She spread them on the table near the fire pit, weighting the corners with river stones, and pointed to places where the land had changed. This bend in the river didn't exist 20 years ago, she said one night, tapping a faded blue line. And this road, it vanished. Not overgrown, vanished. The villagers listened, curious but calm. Change, after all, was nothing new. They didn't fear it. They'd lived through it before. Mira studied the lines on the parchment. Do you think it's natural? She asked. Corla looked at her. I think some places decide to move. Wren, who had been sketching in her own notebook nearby, added quietly, or they're moved by something watching. No one replied, but no one dismissed it either. The next day, the first snow came. It was light at first, then strands of white drifting like ash. Children ran through it laughing, mouths open to catch flakes. Adults moved slower, checking that roofs were sealed, that firewood was stacked, that paths to the well remained clear. The snow fell steadily into the night, and by morning, the village was wrapped in a white stillness so deep that even the animals stepped softer. Inside the cottages, life adjusted. Meals grew simpler. Time stretched. People gathered not for tasks, but for presence. Mira hosted quiet gatherings, no plans, no speeches, just tea, warm bread, and the kind of silence that invited stories to rise unforced. One such evening, Corla shared something different. She unwrapped a small, flat stone, darker than any Mira had seen, etched with lines that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. I found this at the base of the hill east of the forest, Corla said. It wasn't there before. The snow hadn't covered it. It was placed. Mira touched it lightly. The lines weren't drawn. They were burned in or grown. She couldn't tell. Ren leaned in. Does it match anything in your maps? Corla shook her head. Not exactly, but there are similar marks near other places where people feel watched but never afraid. They stared at it in silence. Then, Mira wrapped it back in the cloth and placed it on the mantel, beside an old piece of carved driftwood you had once made. No one said the word magic. Not here, not in this village. They knew too well the weight that word carried elsewhere, how easily it stirred fear, suspicion, or hunger for control. What they felt here was different. One night, long after most had gone to sleep, Mira stepped outside into the snow. The moon was nearly full, the sky clear, the village blanketed in pale silver light. She walked past the fire pit, past the well, down toward the edge of the brook where the trees began to lean. And there she saw it. Not bright, not loud, just a shimmer, a soft ripple in the air, like heat above a road. Though the air was freezing. It moved sideways, then stilled. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She simply stood there and opened her hand, palm facing it, the way you once had taught Ren to greet a deer. The shimmer bent slightly inward toward her and then faded. She exhaled. When she returned to her cottage, she found a sprig of winter mint on her doorstep, fresh, untouched by frost. She placed it in a bowl by the window and said nothing. The days shortened further. Snow deepened. Inside, the village's heartbeat slowed. People stayed close to their fires, their families, their stories. It was during this stretch of winter that a stranger arrived. He came on foot, without a cart, without a beast, and without shoes thick enough for snow. He was older, with white in his beard, and carried a large woven pack strapped to his back. He didn't ask for anything when he entered. He simply stood at the edge of the square until someone offered him a bowl of soup and a seat by the fire. Mira watched him closely. He said his name was Laren, and that he had come from the mountains beyond the far valley. Few knew of any such valley, but no one questioned him. He didn't bring tales of war or hunger. He spoke only of quiet things, of moss that grew only in darkness, of stones that whispered when struck just right, of animals that vanished when named aloud. Ren took a cautious interest in him. He stayed in the guest cottage near the barn, and for weeks said very little more. But he listened, and when he finally spoke again, it was to Mira. Late one night, as they shared a cup of hot barley tea. There are others, he said. Others? Villages like this. Not many, and not easily found. Places where the air bends. Where stories walk like people. Places that remember. Mira didn't answer. She waited. Laren took a small folded cloth from his pack. Inside was another stone, etched, faint, and warm to the touch. This came from one of them, he said. I was told to bring it here. Mira ran her fingers across it. The same spiral, the same marks, Why here? She asked. Laren shrugged. Because this village listens back. And he was right. That spring, as the snow melted and the brook swelled with meltwater, a shift began. Not in the land, but in the people. The children were the first to notice. They began seeing things in the trees again. Shapes, flickers, soft sounds that called for no response. A light that moved without source. They weren't afraid. They weren't surprised. They simply adjusted, stepping around a certain stone, waiting silently near the old garden fence where the air hummed at dusk. Wren kept notes, but her pages began to hold fewer words and more symbols. Shapes she didn't invent, marks that appeared in dreams. One morning, she woke to find a charcoal drawing of a door, one she didn't remember drawing. It had no hinges, no knob, just light pouring through its outline. She showed Mira, who nodded. Slowly, I think it's already open, she said. That summer was warmer than usual. The barley grew thick. The apples sweetened early. No illness came. No fights broke out. The quiet held firm. On the longest day, the entire village gathered at the base of the oak tree. Not for mourning, not for tradition, but because they felt drawn. No one announced it. No one planned. They simply came, carrying baskets of food, blankets, songs remembered halfway. They sat in circles, eyes turned to the branches that had outlived them all. Wren spoke softly. We are not alone, she said, and we never have been, Mira added. But we are safe, because we've chosen to be still. Corla lifted her cup to those who remember, and Laren, his voice barely above the wind, whispered, and to those who watch. They stayed long after sunset. Lanterns lit, bread shared, stories traded without needing to end. And as they drifted homeward, the fire left glowing in the center. Someone placed the carved figure Mira had once left between the graves at the heart of the gathering. And no one said your name aloud, but it was in every gesture, every silence, every breath. That night, a breeze moved through the forest and into the village, soft and warm despite the hour. It rustled the leaves, brushed past doors, circled the square, and vanished. When the children woke the next morning, they found smooth stones on their windowsills, one each. And no two were alike, but all were marked with the same spiral. Some called it a gift, some said it was proof, but most just smiled, pocketed the stones, and went on with their day, because they already knew this place listened, and the story, it was still being written. The days that followed moved slowly, as they often did in the village, but now there was a rhythm that felt older than before. It wasn't just routine anymore, it was something woven. Children woke earlier, not out of obligation, but drawn by something they couldn't name. They sat on the cottage steps watching the mist rise from the fields, sometimes holding the smooth spiral stones they'd found on their windowsills. Some whispered to them, some listened, some just held them without thinking. The adults didn't interfere. They had learned long ago that silence had its own language, and whatever was unfolding now wasn't meant to be guided by instruction. Wren continued to write, but now more of her entries were done in the early hours before sunrise. The ink she used was no longer black. It was mixed with ash, mint oil, and something else, something she had never consciously added. But when she wrote with it, the letters felt warmer beneath her fingers, as if the paper itself remembered. Laren remained quiet in those days, but his presence was constant. He walked the perimeter of the village, stopping at points only he seemed to recognize. Sometimes he'd place a stone on the ground and hum deep, long tones that didn't quite form words. Other times, he'd whisper into the bark of trees and rest his forehead against them, as if listening for a reply. The villagers watched but didn't question. They sensed he wasn't asking for power. He was making introductions. Corla, always watching, always sketching, had begun to compile a new scroll. Not a map this time, but a record of symbols, spirals, door shapes, and the arrangements of stones she found near the edges of paths. She didn't try to interpret them. She only recorded. In the evenings, she showed Mira and Ren the newer pages. Some of the shapes resembled leaves. Others looked like sound waves frozen mid-vibration. Still, others were simple two lines intersecting gently at the center, like a resting place. One afternoon, after a warm rain had swept through and left the fields glistening, a boy named Arno came running into the square, holding something tightly in both hands. He was 10, usually quiet, often seen watching birds from his place atop the fence posts. But now, he was breathless and wide-eyed. "They sang to me," he said, barely forming the words. "In the field, I was alone, and they sang." He opened his hands to reveal nothing, just damp palms and trembling fingers. But Ren understood. "What did it sound like?" she asked. Arno paused. "Like breathing, but with light in it." Mira knelt in front of him. "Did you feel afraid?" He shook his head. "Safe. Like I was supposed to hear it." They let him sit quietly by the fire. No one laughed. No one dismissed him. That evening, Mira told the story aloud, simply, without flourish. She called it, "The Breath Beneath the Field," and Arno listened, smiling shyly, as if hearing it for the first time, even though it was his. Stories like that began to surface more often. Children dreaming of trees with open eyes, animals lingering longer near fences, a girl who woke with tiny leaves growing from her hair, not many, and not lasting, but they're just long enough to be real. Ren recorded them all, not as miracles, not as events, but as threads in the larger weave of the village's being. One morning, as the sun rose behind low clouds, Mira awoke to find a circle of stones arranged outside her door, 12 in all, each slightly different in shape, but each marked with the same spiral carved faintly into the surface. She didn't move them. She stepped over them and poured her tea. Later, Ren came to see them, said nothing, and sat nearby with her notebook, sketching the formation. That night, after the village had quieted and only the embers of the central fire remained glowing, Laren approached the stones and touched each one. Then he turned to Mira. "It's ready," he said. She nodded. "For what?" He looked up at the stars. "To open." They didn't speak more that night, but the next day, Laren gathered several villagers, Ren, Korla, Mira, and 3 of the older children, and led them beyond the brook, into the forest. Not far, just enough to reach a clearing where the trees bent inward in a spiral. There, on the mossy earth, a ring had formed. Not dug, not built. Formed. The ground rose slightly at its edges, and the moss in the center shimmered faintly, not with light, but with presence, like air that hummed. Laren motioned for silence. Then he stepped into the ring. Nothing happened, and yet everything did. The birds went still. The wind stopped. The shimmer returned, faint and transparent, like a breath held in the lungs of the forest. Laren turned slowly, arms wide, then knelt and pressed both palms to the earth. "It hears us," he whispered. Ren stepped forward, not into the ring but to its edge. "What is it?" she asked. "A door," Laren said, "but not to another place, to another listening." No one moved. Then Mira stepped in. As her feet touched the center, the shimmer flickered once, not bright, not loud, just acknowledgement. She closed her eyes and stood there, breathing slowly. When she opened them, she stepped back out. Nothing was said, but from that day forward, the villagers began leaving small offerings in that circle. Carved seeds, pebbles shaped like moons, words written on bark, and left to soften in the rain. They didn't expect answers. They only gave. Back in the village, life continued. The crops grew, the animals thrived. But now, a deeper calm had settled, one that didn't need watching, one that didn't feel borrowed. It belonged to them, not because they owned it, but because they understood it. One evening, Corliss stood before the fire, scroll in hand. "I think," she said, "this village is older than it seems." Mira tilted her head. "How old?" Corla looked up. "Older than memory," Lara nodded. "Some places aren't built. They're remembered into being." And no one questioned it. Ren began carving again. Small figures, birds, leaves, hands open to the sky. She gave them to children without ceremony, placing them gently in palms and walking away. Some she left on doorsteps, others she placed near the forest's edge. One of the children, girl named Everin, asked her why. "So we don't forget to give," Ren said. Everin thought for a moment. "Even when we don't know who's receiving." "Especially then," Ren said, and Everin smiled. The season turned toward autumn once again. Leaves began to curl at their edges. The skies turned a deeper kind of gray, but there was no dread in the change, only quiet preparation. Mira stood by the oak tree one evening as golden light flickered through the branches. She placed her hand on the bark and whispered, "Thank you." Nothing more. No reason. Just thanks. That night, she dreamed of your voice. Not loud. Not even words. Just the presence of it. Warm, unrushed, present. When she woke, the ring of stones outside her door had shifted slightly, still 12, but arranged now in a spiral. Smiled and brewed her tea. And in the distance, the shimmer watched, calm as ever, asking nothing, only knowing. The mornings came softer now. The chill arrived more slowly, pressing gently into the windows before creeping in through the wood, like a polite visitor asking if it might stay a while. Smoke from the hearths lingered longer in the air, curling upward and vanishing into the pale sky like thoughts released and forgotten. The village moved through its final harvest quietly, almost solemnly, though not with sadness. It was the kind of solemnity reserved for things that had been done many times, yet still mattered each time anew. Ren had begun waking before first light. She didn't light her lantern anymore. She moved through the dimness with practiced ease, gathering herbs from her sealing bundles, turning pages in her quiet notebooks, letting her hands move before her thoughts caught up. Her dreams had started leaving traces, not visions, not prophecies, just small gestures. One morning, she found charcoal lines on her palms in the shape of a spiral. Another, she woke to the scent of something sweet and floral, even though nothing bloomed this time of year. She said nothing, wrote nothing of these things, but her eyes had grown more still, as though they saw both the now and something gently running beneath it. The children continued to leave tiny offerings in the moss ring beyond the brook. Feathers, smooth stones, bits of carved bark, snippets of poems overheard and repeated. Sometimes, when they returned the next day, their gifts were gone. Other times, they found new things in their place: a tiny red berry sitting perfectly centered, a folded leaf they hadn't placed there, or a single line etched lightly into the soil, like a smile in the dirt. One child, Everin, had begun dreaming of names, not names she had heard, or read, or been told. These were names that hum. She would wake and whisper them into her pillow, where they lingered until sleep returned. She told no one, except for Ren, who listened carefully, then brought her a piece of cloth and a bit of ash. "Write them when they come," she said. "You don't need to show anyone, but if they visit you, they might want to be remembered." Everin did as she was told. The cloth filled slowly, not with letters, but with curves and marks that only made sense in the dark. She kept it tucked beneath her pillow. Sometimes she fell asleep with her hand resting on it, like a promise not to forget. Laren, the quiet wanderer, had taken to walking the forest edge daily. He carried nothing but a carved staff now, no pack, no food, no scrolls. He spoke even less than before, but when asked, he would say the same thing. I am listening to the trees learn. He never explained, and no one asked again. Mira, too, had changed. Not in a way that most could point to, but in a way that the village felt. Her movements had slowed slightly, not from age, but from depth. She chose her words more carefully now, pausing between sentences, as though weighing not what she was saying, but what she might awaken. Her cottage remained open, her hearth always warm. People came to her for herbs, for advice, for presents, but more and more, they came simply to sit, to be near her. She had become a rootstone, something beneath the surface that others could lean against without needing to understand. It was during one of the long twilights, those drawn-out evenings where dusk hesitated just above the horizon, that a new shift arrived. It came not through a person, or a voice, or even a shimmer. It came in the form of stillness, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet before something remembered. Birds stopped flying overhead. The brook's babble seemed hushed. The wind moved backward for a moment, just once rustling the trees in reverse. And one panicked. But people noticed. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The children stopped playing and looked toward the forest. Not afraid, not excited, only aware. Laren stood from his bench near the fire pit, placed both hands on the earth, and whispered something no one heard. That night, the shimmer appeared again, but this time, not only in the forest. It hovered in the square, soft, transparent, breathing. People gathered slowly, wrapping blankets around shoulders, carrying nothing, saying little. They formed a loose circle around the shimmer and simply watched. It did not expand, it did not change shape, it simply was. Then it spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in understanding. Each person received something different. A memory, a scent, a phrase they hadn't known they remembered, a feeling they couldn't place. Mira saw the oak tree as it had looked before anyone had built a home beside it alone, surrounded by nothing but open hills and wind. Ren felt the pressure of a hand she had never held, but knew deeply. Korla heard music she could not write down. Laren wept silently, his hands still pressed to the soil. The shimmer pulsed once softly and vanished. And one moved for a long time. Then the children began to hum, one at a time, different tones, no melody, no rhythm, just presence and sound, and the adults joined them. The next morning, the village changed. Not visibly, immediately, but entirely. People began leaving their doors open longer. They began walking more slowly to their tasks. Meals were cooked with more herbs, not for taste, but for memory. The stories told at dusk began to blend dreams and history without apology. No one corrected dates. No one insisted on sequence. Time bent gently like reeds in the wind. Ren began planting again, even though it was not the season. Not in the garden, but in unexpected places: the roof, the hollow of a tree stump, the fold of a hill. And things grew, not tall, not quickly, but green things appeared where green things should not have. Korla added pages to her scroll. They were not maps, not even shapes, just textures, impressions. The feeling of the village at a certain hour, the sound of feet on different paths, the way twilight curved around the edges of the barn roof on the last night of a cold moon. Mira began to sleep less, not from restlessness, but because she had begun hearing something in the early hours, a gentle tapping, like fingers on water. She would rise, dress, and walk to the oak. There, she'd sit, hands open, listening. Some mornings she returned with her palms damp, even though there had been no dew. Others, she returned with her eyes wet and shining. It was during one of those early walks that she found the first door. Not a real door, not wood or hinges or frame, but a pattern in the bark of a tree near the edge of the moss ring, a perfect rectangle etched as if by light. She placed her hand on it. The tree pulsed once beneath her fingers. She smiled, said nothing, and walked on. Later that day, Wren found another carved into the stone near the well. Corla found one etched into the underside of a cart. Evren found one inside a folded leaf. They did not open, but they were there, and each person who found one seemed to grow quieter, not from confusion, but from understanding that had not yet reached language. That night, Mira sat by the fire and said, "I think we're being asked." Lara nodded. "Not for permission, for readiness." Wren looked toward the trees. "What happens if we say yes?" Mira answered gently, "I think we already did." The shimmer did not return that week, nor the next, but the presence remained. And in that presence, the village continued, not frozen, not changed, but deepened. Time did not speed up. It slowed down further, not because they wanted it to, because it wanted them to. And so they listened. And so they lived. And so, without needing to be told, they prepared. The mornings continued their quiet descent into the deeper months, each one slightly dimmer, slightly colder, as if the sun was hesitating just a little more with each return. The village did not mind. They had learned long ago that the light was not something to chase but something to greet, however it arrived. Fires burned earlier in the hearths. Tea was brewed with extra sprigs of thyme, and the pathways were lit not just with lanterns, but with familiarity, with memory, with footsteps that knew exactly where to fall. The doors had remained open longer this season, and by now, some were rarely closed at all. Children wandered between cottages without knocking, bringing slices of bread or small berries or news. From one porch to another, elders sat by windows, watching the trees sway in slow, thoughtful rhythms. The air was thick with stories even when no one spoke. Wren had begun dreaming again, this time of water. Not streams or rivers, but still water, perfectly still. A pool that reflected no sky, no self, only depth. She would wake with the taste of it on her lips. Not salt, not sweet, just clean. When she walked, she found herself drawn to places where puddles formed, where moss was softest, where leaves collected in bowls made by stone and earth. She carried a small bowl in her satchel now, carved from a single piece of bark, lined with beeswax. She filled it with drops from the moss ring every morning and placed it beside her bed each night. Mira watched these small changes with quiet respect. She did not ask questions. She did not assign meaning, but she recorded each one in her own way, not with ink, but with gesture. She cooked more often. She began humming again while she stirred. She started leaving the window open at night, even when the frost threatened to creep in. She moved a chair closer to the hearth, not for herself, but for someone who might visit. Laren had grown more still, if that was possible. He no longer wandered the forest edge. Instead, he began tending to the ring beyond the brook, not changing it, not building, just being near it. He would sit beside the spiral of stones and trace his fingers along the moss in long, slow circles. Sometimes, he would sing not songs with melody, but tones, notes that rose and fell like breathing. Children watched from a distance. Sometimes, they joined him, humming along without needing to match his voice. One evening, just before the sky turned to ink, a deep fog rolled into the village. It came from the forest, moving low and slow, curling between trees and slipping into the square. Without a sound. It wasn't thick, but it was full. It carried a weight not of threat, but of presence, a memory wrapped in moisture. The villagers stepped outside, lanterns in hand. Though the lanterns weren't needed, the fog glowed faintly on its own, lit from within by something that never cast a shadow, Ren stood in the center of the square, palms open. Mira joined her, then Laren, then Corla, then the rest, one by one, forming a circle not of ritual, but of readiness. And through the fog, they heard it, a sound like wind moving backward, a tone so low it could only be felt. Then, nothing, but not an empty nothing, a full, waiting nothing. As if the air itself had paused to see what they would do. Laren spoke first. It's asking. Mira's voice followed. Then we answered. No one moved. And then the fog began to lift not away, but upward, spiraling softly into the sky, like a smoke that had forgotten it was once fire. When it cleared, the shimmer stood at the edge of the village again, this time taller, clearer, pulsing not with light, but with rhythm, like a heartbeat. It didn't move, but something in them did. Without speaking, they began walking, not in lines, not in groups, but together, toward the shimmer. And as they approached, it widened, not physically, but perceptually, as if space itself had stretched to welcome them. One by one, they stepped through. There was no flash, no sound, just transition. The inside was not another place. It was the same place, but deeper, like walking into a memory made solid. The trees looked the same, but older. The sky felt heavier, but kinder. The colors were familiar, but softened, as if the world had remembered its own dreams and decided to wear them again. They found themselves in a circle once more, standing in a field they knew and didn't know, a place that had always existed beside their lives, just out of reach, and now they were inside it. Laren stepped forward and knelt. His hand sank slightly into the earth, not wet, not soft, but yielding. He whispered again, this time with no voice. The shimmer pulsed in reply. Ren reached into her satchel and removed the beeswax bowl. She placed it in the center of the circle. The water inside glowed faintly, then stilled. Mira bent beside her and placed a bundle of dried herbs beside the bowl. Lavender, mint, a single feather. Corla added a scrap of parchment, not written, but drawn, a spiral that mirrored the one beneath their feet. And then, silence, a silence that lasted not for minutes, but for something longer than time. When they returned to the village, it was only steps away. They brought nothing visible with them. And yet, something had changed. The paths were lined with new stones. The doorways had faint marks above them, symbols that hadn't been there before, but that no one questioned. And in the sky, a thin line of color stretched from horizon to horizon, not rainbow, not cloud, just color, as if the sky had written something it wasn't ready to say aloud. Life continued, but now, everything echoed. Voices lingered longer in the air. Footsteps rang deeper in the soil. Water took longer to boil, as if it were listening. Children began asking different questions. Not why or when, but what if, and how does it feel? Elders smiled more. Evening stretched further. The moss ring became a place of quiet ritual, not ceremony, not rules, just presence. People came and sat. Some spoke, most didn't. Some left things behind. Others took nothing but a moment. And then, the doors appeared again. This time many on trees, on stones, on the surfaces of water. Some lingered, some vanished. No one opened them, but everyone knew they could. Mira sat by her window one morning, watching the sun rise slower than usual. A child walked past, humming. A bird landed on the sill and did not move. She reached out, let it step onto her finger. It looked at her, truly looked, and blinked once, then flew off. That evening Ren approached the oak tree. She placed her hands on the bark and whispered a name. Not hers, not yours, not one she had ever heard, but it felt right. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, something replied. A slow pulse, a warmth in the roots, and the knowledge that the village was not alone, not just in the watching, but in the belonging. They had become part of something vast and gentle, something that moved not with force, but with invitation. And the story continued. The frost returned with quieter footsteps than before. It slipped into the village slowly, laying soft hands over rooftops, curling around fence posts, and tucking itself into corners of window panes like an old friend who didn't need to knock. There was no surprise in its coming. The people simply added another log to the fire, wrapped their shawls a little tighter, and adjusted their steps to leave no footprints where they weren't meant to linger. The shimmer hadn't appeared again in days, maybe weeks, but its presence had settled into the rhythm of the place, like the silence between the beats of a drum, or the moment a breath is held before a word. It didn't need to be seen. It had been accepted. Mira moved slower now, though. Her hands had not lost their steadiness. She spent more time in the square, not directing, not overseeing, just watching. Sometimes she sat with Ren on the bench beneath the arching vine. Other times she sat alone, but she was never lonely. People came and went around her like wind over tall grass, brushing close but not disrupting. She had become something fixed, something anchoring. Children still brought her things, feathers, drawings, stones with tiny marks they insisted had appeared on their own. She never doubted them. She accepted each offering with the same gentle nod, storing some in the small chest beside her hearth, and others in her memory. The chest was nearly full. The memory never was. Ren had stopped writing. Her notebook sat untouched on the shelf, not because she had finished, but because the words had started arriving too slowly for the page. She spent more time with her, hands in the soil. Now, even in the frost, she had begun growing something that didn't mind the cold. Pale shoots with blue edges, not like any plant she'd seen before. She didn't ask questions. She simply watered them, sang to them, watched them lean toward the shimmer even when it wasn't there. Aaron had vanished. One morning, his cottage was found empty, bed made, fire out. His staff leaned against the door, marked with a new spiral that none had seen before. A pair of boots sat neatly beside it. On the table, a single folded cloth. Inside it, 12 small stones, each etched, each warm to the touch. No note, no sign of departure, just absence. Mira found the stones and passed them out without ceremony. One to each of the oldest villagers. They accepted them with quiet hands, and didn't ask where he had gone. They already knew. Sometimes leaving isn't movement, it's return. The moss ring beyond the brook had deepened in color. The spiral was clearer now, as something laid upon the earth, but something rising from within it. It pulsed faintly at dusk, like a slow breath. People still visited, still left small things. But now, they also sat longer, closed their eyes more often, spoke to it less, and listened more. One child, barely 5, knelt in the ring one evening, and placed both palms on the ground. "They're almost here," she whispered. Mira, watching nearby, asked, "Who?" The child tilted her head. "The ones we remember before we meet." Mira nodded, not because she understood, but because she trusted. That winter passed more gently than the last. The snow came in layers, soft, delicate, never loud. No one went hungry. The wood piles held strong. Fires never went out. Illness stayed far away. And every night, the sky seemed lower, as if bending slightly to be nearer. Then came the dream. To one person, but to every, not on the same night. Not in the same way, but the same dream. A village not theirs, but not unlike it. A sky filled with spirals of color. A path through tall grass that hummed when stepped upon. A door not open, not closed, but aware. And beyond it, not light, not darkness, but warmth. Deep, full, unbreakable warmth. When people spoke of it the next day, there was no surprise, no disbelief, only recognition. They began building again, not out of need, but out of welcome. Small structures near the moss ring, a circular shelter, made from bent branches and dried leaves, another beneath the oak tree, shaped like a spiral shell, a stone bench along the edge of the brook, with no back, only flat space to lie down and look at the sky. They weren't buildings, they were invitations. Wren placed a bowl of her blue-edged plants in the center of the shelter and whispered, "We're ready." And then one evening, just before the first buds of spring, it happened. The shimmer returned. But this time, it brought with it something else, a sound not loud, not constant, but layered, like wind in tall reeds, like pages turning in a deep forest, like memory unrolling itself. It hovered over the moss ring, tall now, taller than the trees. Pulsing gently, it expanded outward, until the entire village was wrapped in its breath. People stepped outside without being called. Children stood barefoot in the snow and did not shiver. Elders closed their eyes and smiled. Wren reached for Mira's hand and said, "This is it." And Mira, calm as ever, replied, "It always was." The shimmer did not speak. It sang not with words, not with notes, but with presence. And as it sang, the village responded not with music, but with stillness, pure, complete stillness, a stillness that filled everything: the soil, the breath, the space between thoughts. Then, from the moss ring, something rose, not a figure, not a light, but a shape, a doorway, outlined in gold, hovering above the spiral, shifting gently like the surface of a lake. It did not open. It did not close. It simply waited. And then the first to step forward was not an elder, not a child, not Wren or Mira. It was a rabbit. Soft, brown, calm. It hopped forward, stepped into the spiral, paused beneath the doorway, and vanished. Not disappeared, not gone, just elsewhere. Next came a crow, then a fox, then a child, then another, and slowly, one by one, people began to follow. Not all. Some stayed. Some sat on the ground and watched, hands resting gently on their knees. No one cried. No one rushed. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't a beginning. It was a remembering. Wren turned to Mira. "Will you come?" Mira smiled. "I already did." And with that, Wren stepped into the ring. She placed her hand on the earth, her other on her heart, looked up once, and was gone. Mira stayed. She returned to her cottage. She placed a new log on the fire. She poured tea into a clay cup that had once belonged to you, and she whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the shimmer began to fade, but the doorway remained, not glowing now, just waiting. Some would say the village changed after that. Some would say it never had. But those who stayed continued to walk the paths, gather the herbs, tend the quiet fires. They welcomed new children born in silence, each one blinking calmly into a world that had long been preparing for them. They told stories that had no beginning, no end. They sang songs with no words. They painted doors on tree trunks just to say hello, and on clear nights, they looked up at the sky and saw not stars, not clouds, but threads, threads that connected everything, not tight, not forced, just there, always. The shimmer no longer returned, because it no longer needed to. It had never been separate. It had only been waiting, waiting for them to remember. And now, they had. So the village breathed, and the earth listened, and the story was still being written,